Being a parent is a lifetime commitment filled with sacrifices. From the moment a child is born, parents dedicate their time, dreams, and financial stability to ensure their children have the best opportunities in life. It's an act of love, often taken for granted. But what happens when the years pass and the roles reverse? When aging parents begin to rely on the very children they raised, how does the modern American family adapt? Margaret Thompson, now 78 years old, had lived her life with one purpose: her daughter, Emily. Margaret had sacrificed everything for her. She worked 2 jobs, made sure Emily had a good education, and even helped pay for her wedding and first home. Where her husband passed away 5 years ago, Margaret felt the deep emptiness of living alone. The house that was once filled with laughter and warmth had become a place of silence and solitude. At first, she managed. She kept herself busy with small hobbies, neighborhood gatherings, and weekly visits to church. But as the years went by, simple tasks became harder. The stairs felt steeper, grocery shopping became exhausting, and the loneliness became unbearable. The occasional phone calls from Emily and her family were comforting, but they never lasted long. Then, one day, after a particularly bad fall in her kitchen, Margaret knew she couldn't live alone anymore. It wasn't just about physical safety. It was the overwhelming sense of isolation that had become too much to bear. She hesitated at first, but finally called Emily and confessed her fears. "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" Emily had said, her voice filled with concern. "You should come live with us. We have plenty of space, and I don't want you to be alone anymore." Margaret was hesitant. She had always believed that parents shouldn't be a burden to their children. She had seen other families struggle with intergenerational living, clashes over privacy, routines, and expectations. But Emily insisted, and Margaret, exhausted from fighting her battles alone, agreed. A month later, she packed up her things, leaving behind the home where she had spent most of her life. As she stepped out the front door for the last time, she took a deep breath. She was trading her independence for companionship, her solitude for the embrace of family. Arriving at Emily's home, Margaret was greeted warmly. The house was beautiful, a spacious 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Emily's husband, Mark, and their 2 children welcomed her with open arms. At first, everything seemed perfect. She enjoyed breakfast with her grandchildren, had meaningful conversations with Emily, and finally felt a sense of belonging again. But as the weeks passed, Margaret began to notice small things. Emily and Mark were always busy, constantly juggling work, parenting, and their own responsibilities. The lively family atmosphere she had longed for wasn't exactly what she had imagined. Even though she was surrounded by loved ones, she often felt invisible. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She was grateful to be there and didn't want to cause trouble. But deep inside, an unsettling feeling was growing. She had spent her life taking care of others, her parents, her husband, her daughter. And now, for the first time, she wondered, would anyone truly take care of her? Little did she know, the real challenges of living with family were just beginning. At first, Margaret thought she had made the right decision. Living with Emily and her family was a blessing, at least on the surface. She woke up to the sounds of her grandchildren laughing, had home-cooked meals with family, and no longer had to endure lonely, silent nights. But something fell off. She quickly noticed that while she was surrounded by family, she wasn't truly part of their lives. Emily and Mark were constantly busy. Emily worked long hours at her corporate job, often taking calls late into the evening, while Mark, a financial analyst, was glued to his laptop even at the dinner table. The children, Henry and Lily, were polite but spent most of their time on their phones or rushing to soccer practice and playdates. Margaret tried to be helpful. She started making breakfast for the kids, tidying up around the house, and folding laundry to ease Emily's burden. "Mom, you don't have to do that," Emily said one evening, coming home from work to find Margaret dusting the bookshelves. "I want to," Margaret replied with a smile. "It makes me feel useful." Emily sighed. "Just take it easy, okay? You're here to relax, not to work." Margaret nodded, but felt uneasy. She wasn't used to being idle. Back in her own home, she had her routines: grocery shopping, gardening, volunteering at the local library. But here, she was a guest in someone else's world. Then, there were the small tensions that slowly began to grow. One night, as they sat down for dinner, Margaret mentioned how Mark never seemed to help with the housework. "Emily, your father always made sure to help out around the house," she said casually, watching as Emily placed a plate in front of Mark. Mark barely looked up from his phone. "Well, I work all day. The least I deserve is a break when I get home." Margaret frowned. She had worked all her life, too, yet she and her late husband had always seen marriage as a partnership. But she said nothing. A week later, she overheard an argument between Emily and Mark in the kitchen. "She's rearranging everything, Mark. I can't find my stuff in my own house," Emily whispered sharply. "She's just trying to help," Mark responded, though his tone lacked conviction. "Yeah, but it's too much. I love her, but we have our own way of doing things here. And she keeps making comments about how we run this house. It's exhausting." Margaret stood frozen in the hallway. The words stung. She never intended to be a burden, never meant to disrupt their home. She thought she was helping, thought she was making herself useful. But to them, she was an inconvenience. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She realized something painful. She was no longer in control of her own life. She had traded her independence for security, but in doing so, she had also surrendered her place in the world. A thought crept in her mind, one she had been avoiding since she moved in. Had she made a mistake? Margaret had always prided herself on being adaptable. Life had thrown its share of challenges her way. Losing her husband, adjusting to life alone, and now, moving in with her daughter's family. But as the weeks passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she no longer belonged. Emily and Mark weren't unkind to her. They were simply busy, wrapped up in their own world of work, responsibilities, and modern parenting. They had their schedules, their routines, and Margaret had become an outsider in the very home she had been invited into. One evening, Margaret sat on the couch, watching as Emily rushed in after work, balancing a phone call, a grocery bag, and Henry's soccer schedule. "Hi, Mom," Emily said absent-mindedly, setting her things down. "Can you pick up Lily from ballet tomorrow? Mark and I both have late meetings." Margaret hesitated. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, though she noticed how the request felt more like an expectation. The errands, the babysitting, the household tasks, they had become part of her daily life, yet no one acknowledged them. At first, she was happy to help, but soon it felt less like helping and more like fulfilling an unspoken duty. One afternoon, while waiting in the car line at Lily's school, Margaret overheard a conversation between two younger mothers. "My mother-in-law moved in last year," one of them sighed. "She's constantly giving me advice I didn't ask for, rearranging my kitchen. It's exhausting." Margaret swallowed hard. Was this how Emily felt? Did her daughter see her as an intruder rather than family? That night at dinner, she tried to bring it up gently. "Emily, I hope I'm not getting in the way," she said, offering a small smile. Emily barely looked up from her plate. "What?" "No, of course not, Mom." Mark nodded in agreement, but didn't say anything. Margaret's heart sank. They hadn't denied it. They hadn't reassured her, either. Later that week, the tension reached its breaking point. Margaret had spent the afternoon cleaning the living room, folding blankets, and tidying up the coffee table. She thought she was helping. But when Emily came home, she let out a frustrated sigh. "Mom, I can't find anything anymore. I appreciate your help, But this is our house. We have a way of doing things. Margaret stiffened. I was just trying to make things easier. Emily's face softened, but she still seemed exasperated. I know, but maybe you don't have to do so much. Just relax, enjoy your time here. Relax? How could she relax when she felt like a guest in her own daughter's home? That night, as she lay in bed, Margaret came to a painful realization. She had left her home to be closer to her daughter, but in doing so, she had lost the very thing she valued most, her independence. For years, she had been strong, self-sufficient, capable. Now, she felt reduced to a shadow, tiptoeing around, trying not to be in the way. Was this really the future she had envisioned? Margaret turned onto her side and stared out the window. For the first time since she had moved in, she asked herself an uncomfortable question. Was it time to leave? Margaret had never been one to make impulsive decisions. She had always thought things through, weighing the pros and cons before taking action. But now, sitting in her daughter's house, no, their house, she felt trapped in a situation she had never expected. The weight of everything had been pressing down on her for months. The silent discomfort, the passive gratitude, the feeling of being an outsider in her own daughter's life. And then came the conversation that sealed her decision. It was a Sunday evening. Margaret had just finished washing the dishes after dinner, while Emily and Mark sat in the living room, discussing something in hushed tones. She wasn't meant to hear, but their voices carried into the kitchen. She's been here for a year, Mark. Emily sighed. I love my mom, but it's been hard. I feel like I can't fully relax in my own home anymore. Mark hesitated. I get it, but what do we do? We can't just ask her to leave. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She stood frozen, dish towel in hand, as she processed their words. So it was true. She had felt like a burden for months, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real. That night, Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought back to the moment she had moved in, the hope she had felt, the belief that this would be a new beginning. Now, she understood that no matter how much love was between them, they had different lives, different needs, and she no longer belonged in theirs. The next morning, Margaret made her decision. Over breakfast, she cleared her throat and looked at Emily with as much strength as she could muster. Sweetheart, I think it's time for me to go home. Emily's spoon clattered against the bowl. What? Mom, why would you say that? Margaret forced a smile. I miss my house, my old routine. I think I need to get back to my own life. Emily frowned, shaking her head. Mom, you don't have to leave. We love having you here. Margaret simply looked at her, waiting. Emily sighed and ran a hand through her hair. I mean, if you really want to. But you don't have to rush. I think it's for the best, Margaret said gently. Mark said nothing. He simply gave a small nod, as if silently acknowledging the truth. By the end of the week, Margaret had packed her things. She didn't have much, just a few bags of clothes and personal items. The furniture, the decorations she had brought to make this place feel like home, would stay. This had never really been her home, after all. On the morning of her departure, Emily helped her carry the bags to the car. Are you sure about this, Mom? She asked one last time. Margaret smiled, placing a hand on her daughter's cheek. I'm sure. You have your life, Emily, and I need to have mine. Emily's eyes welled with tears. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. Always. With one last embrace, Margaret got into the taxi. As the car pulled away, she watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Margaret sat by the window of the small house she had called home for decades, sipping her morning coffee. The familiar creaks of the floor, the scent of old books, and the view of her quiet neighborhood. Everything felt unchanged. Yet, she knew deep inside that she had returned as a different person. The first few days after leaving Emily's house had been difficult. The silence was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, she was truly alone. No footsteps in the hallway, no hurried morning rush, no sound of her grandson's laughter echoing from the other room. Just her and her thoughts. At first, she had wondered if she had made the right choice. Had she left too soon? Should she have fought harder to belong? But then she reminded herself of the truth. She had not left because she wasn't loved, but because love alone was not enough. She needed to reclaim her independence. Determined not to fall into loneliness, Margaret forced herself to step outside. She reconnected with old friends, some of whom she had barely spoken to in years. They welcomed her back with open arms. "We were worried about you, Maggie," her friend Linda said one afternoon as they sipped tea at the local cafe. "Thought you'd never come back." Margaret chuckled. "Honestly, I thought the same for a while." She started attending a senior activity group at the community center, something she had never considered before. There, she met people who understood her struggles, widows, retirees, and parents whose grown children had moved far away. They shared stories, laughter, and sometimes even tears. One afternoon, as Margaret sat in a book club meeting, a woman named Rose leaned over and whispered, "You know, we all go through this, thinking we'll always be needed in our children's lives, only to realize we have to build our own again." Margaret nodded, finally understanding something she had been struggling to accept. Parents are not meant to remain at the center of their children's lives forever. That was never the point of raising them. She was not abandoned. She was simply at the next chapter of her life. Her days became fuller. She started gardening again, filling her backyard with the flowers she loved. She took up painting, a hobby she had given up decades ago. She even began volunteering at a nearby library, helping children pick out books. Occasionally, Emily would call. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom?" she'd ask, guilt still lingering in her voice. Margaret always answered truthfully, "Yes, sweetheart, I'm better than okay." And she meant it. She'd spent her whole life being a mother, a wife, a caretaker. Now, she was learning to be just Margaret again. One evening, as the sun set over her small town, she stood on her porch, watching the sky shift to warm hues of orange and pink. The air was cool, the breeze gentle against her skin. She felt a peace she hadn't felt in years. Margaret had returned to an empty house, but she had not returned to an empty life. She had found herself again. This concludes Margaret's story, one of love, sacrifice, and rediscovering independence in later years. If you've ever had to make a difficult decision about family, what would you have done in her situation? Do you think parents should always live with their children in old age, or is it better for them to have their own space? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more real-life stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.